April 1945. American tanks rolled into the bombed-out shell of Berlin, their tracks crunching over rubble that once housed the financial heart of the Third Reich. Colonel Robert Patterson squinted through the dust-caked windshield of his Jeep, watching GIs move through the skeletal remains of the Reichsbank building. What they found there would spark a mystery that haunted intelligence agencies for decades. The vaults were empty, not just partially looted, completely, methodically stripped bare. Where had $400 million in Nazi gold vanished to? This wasn't just missing treasure. This was the seed money for a shadow war that would define the next 50 years. The discovery at Merker's mine 3 weeks earlier had given the Allies hope. Deep underground in the Thuringian hills, they had uncovered what seemed like the Reich's entire monetary reserve. Gold bars stacked like cordwood, currency bundled in neat piles, artwork wrapped in protective cloth. General Patton himself had descended into those tunnels, his flashlight beam catching the glint of looted gold from Belgium, the Netherlands, and a dozen other conquered nations. The press called it the greatest treasure discovery in military history. But intelligence officers knew better. The Merker's haul was impressive, around $100 million worth, yet it represented only a fraction of what the Nazis had systematically plundered across Europe. The real question wasn't what they had found. It was what remained missing. In a smoke-filled room at the newly established Central Intelligence Group headquarters in Washington, former OSS operative James Angleton spread photographs across a mahogany table. The images showed Swiss bank executives in pressed suits, their faces carefully neutral as they examined gold bars marked with German eagles. These weren't wartime photographs, they were taken in 1946, a full year after Germany's surrender. The gold was flowing again, but now it moved through different channels, guided by different hands. Angleton's thin fingers traced shipping routes on a world map, following lines that connected Zurich to Buenos Aires, Stockholm to Lisbon, and always back to Switzerland. "Follow the gold," Angleton told his assembled team, his voice barely above a whisper. "It never disappears. It just changes hands." The Swiss National Bank had admitted to receiving $440 million in Nazi gold during the war, claiming they had no knowledge of its bloody origins. But declassified Reichsbank documents told a different story. German bankers had been meticulous record keepers, and their files revealed a sophisticated laundering operation that had turned the gold of murdered civilians into clean Swiss francs. Wedding rings melted down and recast into standard bars. Dental fillings extracted in concentration camps and fed into the Reich's monetary system. The Reichsbank had even maintained a special Melma account, specifically for processing gold stolen from Holocaust victims. Yet this industrial-scale plunder was only half the story. As American intelligence officers pieced together the final months of the war, a more disturbing pattern emerged. Beginning in late 1944, as Allied bombers pounded Berlin nightly, the Reichsbank had quietly dispersed its gold reserves to branch banks across southern Germany. But not all of these shipments had been recovered. Entire convoys had simply vanished into the chaos of the collapsing Reich, their destinations known only to a handful of SS officers who had either died in the fighting or melted away into the post-war underground. In the basement of a bombed-out building in Munich, American investigators found something that chilled them more than any missing gold. It was a single sheet of typewritten paper, partially burned but still legible. The document listed what appeared to be Swiss account numbers alongside coded references to South American locations. At the bottom, in faded blue ink, someone had written a single word in English: continuation. The implications hit the intelligence community like a physical blow. The Nazi gold hadn't simply been hidden. It had been deliberately repositioned for use after the war. Someone had planned for the Reich's survival in exile, and they had funded that survival with the stolen wealth of an entire continent. But who? And, more importantly, where was that gold now? Miles away from the American occupation zones, in the pristine banking halls of Zurich, a different kind of war was beginning. Bank executives in dark suits moved through marble corridors, their leather briefcases containing documents that would never see daylight. They spoke in careful euphemisms about irregular deposits and unverified sources. But their ledgers told the real story. Between January 1939 and June 1945, Germany had transferred gold worth around $400 million to neutral countries, with Switzerland serving as the primary conduit. Much of this gold had been systematically laundered through triangular transactions, complex financial instruments that obscured the metal's true origins. The Swiss claimed ignorance, but their own records contradicted this carefully maintained fiction. A memorandum from Reichsbank Director Clodius stated bluntly that Switzerland represents our only means of obtaining freely disposable foreign exchange. The Swiss had knowingly served as the Reich's financial lifeline, accepting looted gold in exchange for the hard currency that kept the Nazi war machine operational. They had been partners, not victims. Now, in the uncertain world of 1946, these same banks found themselves holding assets of questionable origin and unquestionable value. The Americans demanded restitution, but the Swiss stalled with bureaucratic precision. They raised objections about exchange rates, insisted on debt settlements, and demanded that German assets seized during the war be unfrozen and returned to their rightful Swiss owners. Every delay, every legal technicality, bought time for the gold to be moved, reprocessed, or simply absorbed into the vast anonymity of the international banking system. It was a masterclass in financial manipulation, and it was working. But the Americans had learned something during the war about playing by different rules. As the Marshall Plan pumped billions of dollars into European reconstruction, a parallel stream of funding flowed into much darker channels. The National Security Act of 1947 officially created the Central Intelligence Agency, but it also authorized something else, a black budget that operated outside normal governmental oversight. This shadow funding would eventually grow to dwarf the Reich's missing gold, reaching $52 billion by 2013. But in those early days, when the Cold War was still taking shape, every dollar mattered. And some of those dollars, intelligence veterans whispered decades later, might have started their journey in the vaults of a bombed-out Berlin bank. The pattern was becoming clear to those who knew how to read it. The Nazi gold hadn't disappeared. It had been transformed into something else. A financial foundation for the covert operations that would define the Cold War. The missing $400 million wasn't treasure waiting to be discovered. It was working capital for the shadow war that had already begun. In the files of the newly created CIA, James Angleton maintained a special folder marked simply Continuation. Inside were photographs, bank records, shipping manifests, and interrogation transcripts from captured SS officers. The documents painted a picture of meticulous planning and careful preparation. The Reich's inner circle had known the war was lost, but they had also known that the war's end would mark the beginning of something else. A different kind of conflict, fought with different weapons in different shadows. The gold was just the beginning. As autumn 1947 arrived in Berlin, American intelligence officers noticed something odd. Former Nazi officials who should have been destitute were living comfortably in the western sectors. They had new identities, clean papers, and most tellingly, access to hard currency in a city where dollars were more valuable than life itself. When pressed about their funding sources, these men offered vague explanations about hidden family assets or successful black market trades. But their stories never quite added up, and their Swiss bank account numbers always seemed to start with the same 3 digits. The same 3 digits that had appeared on the partially burned document found in Munich. Colonel Patterson, now reassigned to the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, spent long nights in his requisition department overlooking the ruins of Potsdamer Platz. He kept returning to a simple question that haunted him. What if the Nazi gold hadn't been stolen by opportunistic individuals in the chaos of defeat? What if its disappearance had been carefully orchestrated by people who understood that the real war was just beginning? The answer, he suspected, lay somewhere in the intersection between the old Reich's death and the new world's birth. In those gray zones where American intelligence officers made deals with former SS men, where Swiss bankers facilitated transactions they preferred not to examine too closely, and where the gold that had once funded genocide might now be funding something else entirely. Something that wore the flag of freedom but cast the shadow of the very evil it claimed to fight. The missing gold was out there, flowing through channels both old and new, transforming itself from the Reich's legacy into the Cold War's inheritance. And somewhere in the darkness between Washington and Zurich, between justice and necessity, between what the world needed to believe and what the world actually was, that gold was beginning its next phase of existence. The hunt was only beginning. August 1947. The port of Genoa shimmered under the Mediterranean sun as Father Krunoslav Draganović adjusted his black cassock and checked his pocket watch. The Croatian priest maintained an office in the ancient monastery of San Girolamo degli Illyrici, but his real work happened in the shadows between the confessionals and the shipping manifests. American intelligence officers called him the architect of rat lines, the elaborate escape routes that spirited Nazi war criminals out of Europe and into new lives across the Atlantic. What they didn't know was that Draganović wasn't just moving people. He was moving something far more valuable. The Americans had recovered $262 million worth of Nazi gold from the Merkers mine and other caches across Germany. But Reichsbank records suggested the Reich had controlled assets worth nearly twice that amount. The difference wasn't lost in bookkeeping errors or wartime chaos. It had been deliberately moved, methodically repositioned by men who understood that losing a war didn't necessarily mean losing a fortune. They just had to be smart about where they buried it. In the basement of the San Girolamo monastery, beneath prayer books and religious artifacts, lay wooden crates marked with innocuous religious symbols. Inside these crates, wrapped in thick cloth and nestled between layers of straw, were gold bars bearing the stamps of central banks from across occupied Europe. The gold had traveled a complex route from bombed-out Berlin to this quiet Italian sanctuary. Some had come through Switzerland, cleaned by obliging bankers who asked few questions about provenance. Other shipments had followed more direct paths, carried by SS officers who had traded their uniforms for civilian clothes and their allegiance to the Reich for personal survival. Draganović was not acting alone. The Catholic Church had developed what intelligence analysts would later call the monastery pipeline, a network of priests, bishops, and Vatican officials who facilitated the escape of war criminals they considered valuable allies against communism. The Church's motivation was partly theological, partly political. They saw former Nazis as potential soldiers in the coming struggle against Soviet atheism. But there was also a more practical consideration. The Church needed funding for its covert operations, and Nazi gold provided a ready source of untraceable capital. The gold that passed through Draganović's hands wasn't destined for church coffers. It was being transformed into something more useful. Working capital for a new kind of warfare that was already beginning to take shape in the shadows of post-war Europe. American intelligence agencies were discovering that fighting communism required different tactics than fighting conventional armies. They needed agents who could operate behind enemy lines, resistance movements that could survive without official support, and most importantly, funding that couldn't be traced back to Washington. Nazi gold was perfect for these purposes. It was already stolen, already dirty, already disconnected from normal banking channels. Men like Draganović could launder it through religious organizations, emigrant aid societies, and anti-communist political movements. The gold would emerge as clean donations, legitimate business investments, or charitable contributions. By the time it reached American intelligence operatives in Vienna or Berlin, its origins were buried beneath layers of false documentation and intermediary transactions. But the rat lines weren't just about money. They were about people. Specifically, the kind of people who possessed skills that the emerging Cold War intelligence community desperately needed. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, found himself recruited by American intelligence for his expertise in combating communist organizations. Reinhard Gehlen, former head of Nazi military intelligence on the Eastern Front, was given command of what would become West Germany's primary intelligence service. These men brought more than knowledge. They brought contacts, networks, and most importantly, access to the financial resources they had squirreled away during the war's final months. The arrangement was as cynical as it was effective. Former SS officers who should have faced war crimes tribunals instead found themselves drawing American salaries and operating with official protection. In exchange, they provided intelligence on Soviet activities and helped establish the anti-communist networks that would become crucial to Cold War strategy. The gold that had once funded genocide was now funding a different kind of conflict, one where the battle lines were drawn in bank accounts rather than trenches. Cardinal Giovanni Montini, who would later become Pope Paul VI, maintained careful records of the Church's involvement in these operations. His private papers, discovered decades later in Vatican archives, revealed the scope of the monastery pipeline. Between 1945 and 1951, the Church had facilitated the escape of approximately 30,000 refugees from communist territories. Many were legitimate refugees fleeing political persecution, but hidden among them were hundreds of war criminals carrying false papers and considerable financial resources. The Vatican justified its actions by pointing to the greater threat posed by Soviet communism. Church officials argued that former Nazis who had converted to anti-communist causes deserved redemption and protection. They conveniently ignored the fact that many of these converts had never abandoned their core beliefs. They had simply found new enemies and new sponsors. The gold that flowed through church channels wasn't buying salvation, it was buying silence and protection for men who should have faced justice. American intelligence agencies were initially reluctant participants in this moral compromise. Officers like James Angleton understood the strategic value of former Nazi networks, but they also recognized the dangerous precedent they were setting. The decision to work with war criminals wasn't made lightly. It was driven by the emerging reality of the Cold War, where ideological purity took second place to operational effectiveness. The Soviets were already recruiting former Nazis for their own intelligence services. American agencies felt they had little choice but to compete for the same talent pool. The process of converting Nazi gold into Cold War currency required careful coordination between multiple organizations. Swiss banks provided the initial laundering services, transforming marked German gold into clean Swiss francs. Vatican banks then converted these francs into various currencies through their international network of financial institutions. Finally, American intelligence agencies accessed these funds through seemingly legitimate front organizations, anti-communist political parties, emigrant aid societies, and cultural foundations that operated across Europe and Latin America. The most ambitious of these operations centered on an organization called Intermarium, a proposed federation of Eastern European states that would serve as a buffer against Soviet expansion. The concept was supported by Polish, Czech, and Hungarian exile communities, but it was funded largely by laundered Nazi gold that had been processed through Vatican channels. Intermarium never achieved its political goals, but it served as an effective vehicle for distributing intelligence funding to anti-communist networks throughout Eastern Europe. The gold trail led to some unlikely destinations. In Argentina, Juan Perón's government welcomed both Nazi refugees and their financial resources with open arms. Buenos Aires became a major hub for former SS officers who had escaped through the monastery pipeline, many carrying Swiss bank account numbers provided by Father Draganovich. These men didn't simply disappear into South American society. They maintained contact with their handlers in American intelligence, providing information about communist activities in Latin America and serving as the foundation for anti-leftist networks that would operate for decades. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the rat line operations was how they corrupted the institutions designed to pursue justice. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg had established clear principles about war crimes and criminal conspiracy. The rat lines systematically undermined these principles by protecting war criminals from prosecution and providing them with new identities and financial resources. Justice wasn't being served, it was being purchased with stolen gold and buried beneath layers of geopolitical necessity. The transformation was complete by 1950. Nazi gold that had begun its journey in the concentration camps of Europe had been converted into the operational currency of American intelligence agencies. The same financial resources that had once funded the Holocaust were now funding anti-communist operations from Berlin to Buenos Aires. The moral implications were staggering, but they were buried beneath classification stamps and bureaucratic euphemisms. The gold wasn't stolen, it was recovered assets. The war criminals weren't being protected. They were valuable intelligence sources. The rat lines weren't escape routes, they were refugee assistance programs. Years later, when investigators finally gained access to classified documents from this period, they would discover that the rat line operations had moved far more than people and money. They had also transported something more intangible but equally dangerous: the institutional knowledge and operational methods of the Nazi security apparatus. Former Gestapo interrogators taught their techniques to American intelligence officers. SS recruitment methods were adapted for building anti-communist networks. The organizational structure that had once served the Reich was rebuilt to serve new masters with new enemies. The gold was gone, transformed and dispersed through 1,000 different channels. But its legacy lived on in the networks it had funded, the people it had protected, and the compromises it had purchased. The rat lines had achieved their immediate objectives. They had helped America build an effective intelligence apparatus for fighting the Cold War. But they had also planted the seeds of future scandals, future revelations, and future reckonings with a past that refused to stay buried. In the quiet corridors of the San Girolamo Monastery, Father Draganovich continued his work long after the last Nazi refugee had been processed and the final gold shipment had been forwarded to its destination. He maintained detailed records of his operations, careful logs that tracked every transaction and every person who had passed through his network. These records would eventually become evidence in war crimes investigations that stretched well into the 21st century. But in 1950, they were simply the bookkeeping of an enterprise that had successfully transformed the Reich's stolen wealth into the Cold War's working capital. The missing gold wasn't missing anymore. It was working, building networks and buying silence and funding operations that would define the next 4 decades of global conflict. And somewhere in the intersection between justice and necessity, between what the world claimed to believe and what it actually practiced, the ghost of the Third Reich had found new life in the institutions that claimed to oppose everything it had represented. December 1949. Snow fell quietly on the cobblestone streets of Zurich as Emil Pohl adjusted his expensive overcoat and walked through the doors of the Credit Suisse building on Paradeplatz. The former Reichsbank vice president should have been in a war crimes prison, serving time for his role in processing stolen gold through German financial institutions. Instead, he was conducting business in Switzerland, armed with impeccable references from American intelligence officers who found his expertise more valuable than his prosecution. Pohl carried with him something more precious than the banking credentials that had earned him his freedom: detailed knowledge of where the Reich's missing gold reserves had been relocated during those final chaotic months of the war. The Swiss banking system had emerged from World War II with its reputation carefully intact and its vaults substantially heavier. Swiss National Bank records showed that Germany had transferred 414 tons of gold to Switzerland between 1939 and 1945, worth approximately $440 million at wartime exchange rates. The Swiss claimed they had acted in good faith, accepting German gold based on official certifications of legitimate ownership. But Pohl knew better. He had personally overseen the melting and recasting operations that transformed looted gold from across occupied Europe into standard Swiss acceptable bars. The dental fillings extracted in Auschwitz had been processed through the same furnaces as Belgian national reserves and French private holdings. Now, in the comfortable offices of Swiss financial institutions, Pohl was helping American intelligence agencies understand something the Nuremberg prosecutors had never fully grasped: the extent to which Nazi Germany had transformed stolen wealth into working capital for post-war operations. The gold hadn't simply been hoarded in Alpine Bank vaults. It had been actively invested, carefully managed, and systematically deployed to fund networks that had survived the Reich's collapse. Swiss bankers had been more than passive recipients of German deposits. They had been active partners in creating the financial infrastructure that allowed Nazi ideology to survive in new forms under new sponsors. The scale of the Swiss operation was breathtaking in its sophistication. The Union Bank of Switzerland had processed German gold through a complex system of triangular transactions that involved Swedish banks, Portuguese institutions, and South American financial houses. Gold entered Switzerland, marked with German eagles, and emerged as clean international reserves that could be deposited anywhere in the world, without questions about provenance. The process required careful coordination between multiple financial institutions and the active cooperation of Swiss banking authorities, who understood exactly what they were facilitating. But the Swiss connection went beyond simple money laundering. Swiss intelligence agencies had maintained extensive contacts with Nazi security services throughout the war, ostensibly for defensive purposes, but actually for mutual benefit. Swiss intelligence officers had provided German agents with safe passage through Swiss territory, while German intelligence had shared information about Allied activities with Swiss counterparts, who were concerned about maintaining their neutrality. These relationships didn't end with Germany's surrender. They evolved into something more useful, a network of former intelligence operatives who could facilitate the kind of covert operations that were becoming central to American Cold War strategy. American intelligence officers discovered that several major Swiss banks had been systematically investing Nazi gold in industrial enterprises across South America. The investments weren't random. They were strategically focused on industries that could provide technological and logistical support for covert operations. German expatriates who had escaped through the Ratlins found employment in these Swiss-funded enterprises, maintaining their technical skills while building new networks that remained loyal to their former commanders. The gold was generating dividends, but those dividends weren't being distributed to shareholders. They were being reinvested in activities that served the strategic interests of American intelligence agencies fighting the Cold War. The most disturbing aspect of the Swiss connection was how it had corrupted the post-war restitution process. The Allies had demanded that Switzerland return looted gold to its countries of origin, but Swiss negotiators had stalled with bureaucratic precision while quietly transferring assets to accounts beyond Allied jurisdiction. By the time the Washington Agreement was signed in 1946, requiring Switzerland to transfer 250 tons of gold to the Allied restitution pool, much of the original Nazi gold had already been moved to South American banks, Portuguese institutions, and Caribbean financial havens that operated beyond Allied oversight. The Americans found themselves in an impossible position. They needed Swiss cooperation to access the financial networks that were essential for fighting communism, but they also needed to maintain the fiction that justice was being served for wartime crimes. The solution was typically pragmatic. American negotiators publicly demanded restitution while privately facilitating the very activities they were supposed to prevent. Swiss banks continued processing questionable transactions as long as they served American strategic interests. The gold flowed through new channels toward new destinations, but the essential pattern remained unchanged. In a secure conference room at the American Embassy in Bern, CIA officer Frank Wisner reviewed financial documents that painted a comprehensive picture of the Swiss operation. The documents showed that Nazi gold had been systematically converted into investments in American corporations, Swiss industrial enterprises, and South American infrastructure projects. The investments weren't passive holdings. They were active partnerships that gave former Nazi operatives influence over strategic industries and communication networks. The Reich's stolen wealth was being used to build the kind of international networks that American intelligence agencies needed for conducting covert operations across multiple continents. Wisner understood the moral implications of what he was reviewing, but he also understood the strategic necessities that drove American policy. The Soviet Union was building its own international networks using similarly questionable methods. American agencies felt they had little choice but to compete using whatever resources were available, regardless of their origins. The Nazi gold provided those resources, along with the experienced personnel who understood how to use them effectively. It was a devil's bargain, but it was a bargain that American policymakers had consciously chosen to make. The Swiss operation had also created an unexpected problem for American intelligence agencies. It had made them dependent on financial networks that they didn't fully control. Swiss bankers held detailed records of American intelligence transactions, giving them leverage that could be used to influence American policy. Former Nazi operatives who had been integrated into these networks retained knowledge that could embarrass American agencies if it became public. The gold had bought American intelligence agencies' operational capability, but it had also created vulnerabilities that would haunt them for decades. By 1950, the transformation was complete. Nazi gold had been converted into the working capital of American intelligence agencies, processed through Swiss banks and deployed through international networks that operated beyond normal governmental oversight. The same financial resources that had once funded the Holocaust were now funding anti-communist operations from Korea to Guatemala. The moral compromise was staggering, but it was buried beneath classification stamps and diplomatic agreements that kept the truth from public scrutiny. Swiss banking records from this period, released decades later under international pressure, revealed the extent to which supposedly neutral institutions had served as active partners in both Nazi war crimes and American Cold War operations. The same banks that had processed gold stolen from Holocaust victims also processed payments to anti-communist guerrillas in Eastern Europe. The same financial networks that had laundered Nazi plunder also laundered CIA operational funds that were used to influence elections, fund coups, and support authoritarian regimes that served American strategic interests. The Swiss connection had created something unprecedented in modern history, a direct financial link between the crimes of the past and the covert operations of the present. Nazi gold had been transformed into Cold War currency, but the transformation hadn't eliminated its moral toxicity. It had simply disguised that toxicity beneath layers of legitimate-seeming transactions and politically acceptable justifications. The gold was working, generating dividends and funding operations that served American interests. But it was also corrupting every institution it touched, creating moral compromises that would eventually demand their own reckoning. In the quiet offices of Swiss banks, former Nazi operatives continued their work under new management and with new objectives. They maintained the same networks, used the same methods, and served the same strategic functions they had performed during the war. The only difference was the flag they served and the enemies they opposed. The gold that had once funded genocide was now funding a different kind of warfare, but the essential character of that warfare, its secrecy, its moral flexibility, its willingness to use any means necessary, remained fundamentally unchanged. The missing gold wasn't missing anymore. It was embedded in the financial infrastructure of the Cold War, generating returns and funding operations that would define global politics for the next 4 decades. And somewhere in the intersection between Swiss neutrality and American necessity, between financial pragmatism and moral principle, the ghost of the Third Reich had found a new home in the institutions that claimed to represent freedom and democracy. The transformation was complete, but the reckoning was still to come. November 1952. The coffee shops of Vienna hummed with whispered conversations conducted in a dozen languages, but the most important discussions happened in places where tourists never ventured. Deep beneath the bombed-out opera house, in tunnels that had once sheltered civilians from Allied bombing raids, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Klaus Barbie, the former Gestapo chief known as the Butcher of Lyon, sat across from CIA operative James Jesus Angleton, discussing something that would have horrified the very victims whose stolen wealth had made this conversation possible. They were planning the establishment of the largest underground network in Cold War history, and they were going to fund it with Nazi gold that had been carefully laundered through Swiss banks and Vatican accounts. The transformation was complete, but invisible. What had begun as the Reich's stolen treasure had evolved into the operational foundation of American intelligence networks that stretched from Eastern Europe to South America. The gold no longer bore German eagles or concentration camp markings. It had been melted, recast, and converted into the clean currency of Cold War operations. But its essential character remained unchanged. It was still stolen wealth being used to fund activities that operated beyond the normal boundaries of law and morality. American intelligence agencies had discovered something that would define their operations for the next 4 decades. The most effective anti-communist networks were built from the remnants of Nazi intelligence services. These networks possessed 3 crucial advantages. They had deep knowledge of Soviet operations from wartime experience. They maintained extensive contacts throughout Eastern Europe, and most importantly, they had access to funding sources that couldn't be traced back to American government appropriations. The Nazi gold provided the perfect solution to the problem of financing operations that Congress would never approve and the American public would never support. The Vienna operations represented the most sophisticated integration of former Nazi personnel into American intelligence activities. Under the cover of refugee assistance programs, CIA officers recruited hundreds of former SS and Gestapo operatives who possessed detailed knowledge of communist organizations in their home countries. These men didn't simply provide information, they actively rebuilt the intelligence networks they had operated during the war, adapting their methods to serve new masters with new objectives. The funding for these operations came through a complex web of Swiss bank accounts, Vatican charities, and South American investment funds that could trace their origins back to the gold stolen from concentration camp victims. But the Vienna networks were just the beginning. Similar operations were established in Rome, Madrid, and Buenos Aires, each drawing on the same pool of former Nazi operatives and the same sources of laundered funding. The pattern was always the same. Intelligence agencies would identify valuable former Nazis, provide them with new identities and financial support, and then deploy them against communist targets. The moral compromises were justified by the strategic necessities of the Cold War, but the practical effect was to create a global network of operatives whose methods and moral flexibility had been forged in the furnaces of the Third Reich. The financial mechanisms that supported these networks were works of art in their complexity and cynicism. Nazi gold that had been processed through Swiss banks was converted into investments in South American industrial enterprises. These enterprises then generated legitimate income that could be used to fund anti-communist activities without raising questions about the money's origins. Former Nazi operatives found employment in these Swiss-funded companies, maintaining their technical skills while building new networks that served American strategic interests. The gold was working, generating dividends that funded a shadow war across multiple continents. The Vatican's role in these operations went far beyond simply providing escape routes for war criminals. Catholic institutions served as financial intermediaries, converting laundered Nazi gold into charitable contributions that could be used to fund anti-communist political movements throughout Eastern Europe. The Church's extensive international network provided the perfect cover for intelligence operations, allowing CIA operatives to operate under religious cover while accessing funding that appeared to come from legitimate charitable sources. The same priests who had helped war criminals escape through the rat lines now helped American intelligence agencies fund their covert operations. By 1953, the network had achieved something unprecedented in intelligence history. It had created a self-sustaining financial ecosystem that operated independently of normal government oversight. Nazi gold had been converted into investments that generated returns, which were then reinvested in operations that served American strategic interests. The system was brilliant in its moral flexibility and terrifying in its implications. The stolen wealth of Holocaust victims was being used to fund activities that bore uncomfortable similarities to the operations that had created that wealth in the first place. The operations weren't limited to Europe. American intelligence agencies used the same networks and funding sources to establish anti-communist activities throughout Latin America. Former Nazi operatives who had escaped through the ratlins found themselves recruited for operations in Guatemala, Chile, and Argentina. They brought with them not just their intelligence experience, but also their methods. Interrogation techniques developed in Gestapo cellars, recruitment strategies perfected in occupied territories, and operational security measures learned from running resistance networks during the war. The gold that had once funded these activities for the Reich now funded them for the CIA. The most disturbing aspect of these operations was how they corrupted every institution they touched. Swiss banks that had laundered Nazi gold found themselves deeply embedded in American intelligence operations, providing financial services that went far beyond normal banking relationships. Vatican institutions that had helped war criminals escape found themselves serving as front organizations for CIA funding operations. South American governments that had welcomed Nazi refugees found themselves hosting American intelligence operations that used the same personnel and methods. The network had achieved operational success, but it had also created moral contradictions that would eventually demand their own reckoning. American intelligence agencies found themselves dependent on financial networks they didn't fully control, operated by people whose loyalty was ultimately to themselves rather than to any national or ideological cause. The Nazi gold had bought operational capability, but it had also bought moral compromise on a scale that dwarfed anything in American intelligence history. The transformation was complete by the mid-1950s. Nazi gold had been converted into the operational foundation of American Cold War intelligence activities. The same financial resources that had once funded the Holocaust were now funding anti-communist operations from Berlin to Buenos Aires. The moral implications were staggering, but they were buried beneath classification stamps and operational necessities that made questioning impossible for anyone with access to the truth. In secure conference rooms from Langley to Zurich, intelligence officers reviewed operational reports that documented the success of their underground networks. The statistics were impressive. Hundreds of communist agents identified and eliminated, dozens of Soviet operations disrupted, entire resistance movements established behind the Iron Curtain. But the reports never mentioned the true cost of these successes. They never calculated the moral price of using stolen wealth to fund operations that bore uncomfortable similarities to the activities that had created that wealth. They never acknowledged that the fight against one form of totalitarianism had been funded by the profits of another. The underground networks represented both the culmination and the corruption of American intelligence capabilities. They were highly effective at achieving their operational objectives, but they were also morally compromised in ways that would eventually undermine the very values they claimed to defend. The Nazi gold had purchased operational success, but it had also purchased moral failure on a scale that would haunt American intelligence agencies for decades to come. Somewhere in the intersection between strategic necessity and moral compromise, between fighting communism and embracing the methods of those who had fought democracy, the missing Nazi gold had found its final resting place. It wasn't buried in alpine caves or hidden in secret accounts. It was working, every day, funding operations that shaped the course of global politics while carrying forward the legacy of the very evil it had helped create. The gold had disappeared, but its influence lived on in every intelligence operation it funded, every network it sustained, and every moral compromise it purchased. The underground networks were the ultimate expression of the Nazi gold's transformation from stolen treasure into Cold War currency. They represented the complete integration of the Reich's financial resources into American intelligence operations, but they also represented the moral corruption that such integration inevitably produced. The missing gold wasn't missing anymore. It was embedded in the institutional DNA of the Cold War intelligence apparatus, shaping operations and corrupting institutions in ways that would define global politics for the next 4 decades. September 1989. The Berlin Wall crumbled under the hammers and pickaxes of celebrating Germans, but in the secure basement of a Zurich bank, elderly men in expensive suits were destroying documents that told a different story about the Cold War's end. Hans Berger, now 73 and officially retired from Credit Suisse, fed decades of financial records into an industrial shredder, while his associates methodically deleted computer files that contained account numbers, transaction records, and client identities that could never be allowed to see daylight. The documents they were destroying represented the final chapter in the longest money laundering operation in modern history. The systematic conversion of Nazi gold into the operational currency of the Cold War intelligence apparatus. The end of the Soviet Union hadn't brought the moral reckoning that many had expected. Instead, it had triggered a frantic effort to bury evidence of operations that had shaped 4 decades of global politics. The same Swiss banks that had laundered Nazi gold in the 1940s were now laundering the evidence of how that gold had been used during the Cold War. The same Vatican officials who had operated rat lines for war criminals were now operating similar networks for intelligence operatives whose knowledge had become too dangerous for their former employers. The transformation was complete, but so was the cover-up. American intelligence agencies faced an unprecedented crisis as classified documents from the Cold War period began surfacing in Eastern European archives. The Stasi files revealed extensive cooperation between American agencies and former Nazi operatives who had been funded with laundered Reich gold. Hungarian secret police records documented CIA payments to anti-communist networks that could be traced back to Swiss accounts established with Holocaust victims' wealth. Polish intelligence archives contained interrogation transcripts of American agents who had inadvertently revealed the true sources of their operational funding. The revelations painted a picture that was both more extensive and more morally compromised than anyone had imagined. The Nazi gold hadn't simply funded isolated intelligence operations. It had provided the financial foundation for a global network of covert activities that had influenced elections, supported coups, and funded proxy wars across 5 continents. The stolen wealth of Holocaust victims had been systematically converted into the working capital of American foreign policy, creating moral contradictions that went to the heart of post-war democratic institutions. But the most disturbing revelations came from an unexpected source. In 1991, a CIA accounting review triggered by budget constraints revealed that approximately 60% of the agency's operational funding during the 1950s and 60s had come from sources that couldn't be traced to congressional appropriations. Internal investigations, conducted with extreme secrecy, revealed that much of this off-books funding could be traced back to investment returns generated by assets that had originated in Nazi gold reserves. The gold hadn't simply been used for one-time operations. It had been systematically invested to create ongoing revenue streams that had funded American intelligence activities for decades. The financial architecture was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. Nazi gold processed through Swiss banks had been invested in American corporations, South American industrial enterprises, and European reconstruction projects. The returns from these investments had been channeled through a complex network of foundations, charities, and front organizations that provided clean funding for intelligence operations. By the 1980s, this network was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually in operational funding that operated entirely outside normal governmental oversight. The system had achieved something unprecedented in intelligence history. It had created a shadow government that was funded by stolen wealth and operated independently of democratic institutions. American intelligence agencies found themselves running operations that were funded by Holocaust victims' gold, staffed by former Nazi operatives, and justified by Cold War necessities that had long since ceased to exist. The moral compromises that had seemed necessary in 1947 had become institutional corruption by 1987. The Swiss connection had evolved into something even more disturbing than simple money laundering. Swiss banks had become active partners in American intelligence operations, providing not just financial services, but also operational support for activities that would have been impossible without their cooperation. Former Nazi gold had been used to purchase Swiss bank secrecy, creating financial networks that operated beyond the reach of any government or international organization. The banks hadn't simply processed stolen wealth. They had become co-conspirators in its transformation into Cold War currency. As congressional investigators began examining these revelations in the early 1990s, they discovered that the Nazi gold trail led directly to some of the most controversial American intelligence operations of the Cold War period. The Bay of Pigs invasion had been partially funded with laundered Nazi gold. The overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile had been supported by networks that traced their financial origins back to Holocaust victims' wealth. The Iran-Contra scandal had revealed funding mechanisms that had been originally established to process Nazi gold through Swiss and Vatican channels. The pattern was consistent and damning. American intelligence agencies had become dependent on funding sources that compromised their moral authority and democratic accountability. The Nazi gold had purchased operational capability, but it had also purchased institutional corruption on a scale that threatened the foundation of democratic governance. The missing gold wasn't missing anymore. It was embedded in the DNA of American intelligence operations, shaping institutional culture and operational methods in ways that would be difficult to reverse. The final revelation came from an unexpected source. In 1994, Russian intelligence officers offered to sell American investigators a complete archive of Soviet intelligence records from the Cold War period. The archive contained detailed information about American intelligence operations that the Soviets had penetrated, including financial records that documented the true sources of American operational funding. The Russians weren't interested in money. They wanted to demonstrate that American moral superiority during the Cold War had been largely fictional. The Soviet records confirmed what American investigators had begun to suspect. The Cold War had been fought by both sides using similar methods and similar moral compromises. Soviet intelligence agencies had also recruited former Nazi operatives, also used stolen wealth to fund their operations, and also justified their actions by claiming strategic necessity. The difference wasn't in the methods used, but in the stories each side told about those methods. The Americans had convinced themselves they were fighting for freedom and democracy. The Soviets had convinced themselves they were fighting for equality and justice. Both sides had been fighting with stolen wealth and compromised personnel. The moral reckoning that followed these revelations was incomplete and unsatisfying. Congressional hearings were held, but most of the testimony was classified. Apologies were offered, but they were carefully worded to avoid legal liability. Restitution was promised, but the funds had been so thoroughly laundered and dispersed that meaningful restitution was impossible. The Swiss banks paid nominal fines while maintaining their secrecy. The Vatican issued statements about learning from past mistakes while continuing to resist full disclosure of their wartime activities. By the end of the 1990s, the Nazi gold scandal had been largely forgotten by the American public, buried beneath more immediate concerns about terrorism and globalization. But the institutional corruption it had created lived on in intelligence agencies that had learned to operate with minimal oversight and maximum moral flexibility. The gold had disappeared, but its legacy persisted in operational methods and institutional cultures that continued to prioritize effectiveness over accountability. The missing Nazi gold had achieved its final transformation, from stolen treasure to Cold War currency to institutional corruption. It had purchased 4 decades of intelligence operations, but it had also purchased 4 decades of moral compromise that would define American foreign policy well into the 21st century. The gold wasn't missing anymore because it had become something else entirely. The hidden foundation of a national security apparatus that had learned to justify any action by appealing to strategic necessity. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of the Nazi gold story wasn't what had been stolen or where it had gone. It was what it had purchased, the systematic corruption of democratic institutions by people who convinced themselves they were defending democracy. The gold had funded operations that won the Cold War, but it had also funded the transformation of American intelligence agencies into institutions that bore uncomfortable similarities to the very enemies they had been created to fight. The final reckoning was that there was no final reckoning. The Nazi gold had succeeded beyond its creators' wildest dreams, not by preserving the Third Reich, but by corrupting the institutions that had defeated it. The missing gold wasn't missing because it had never really disappeared. It had simply changed form, from physical treasure to institutional corruption, from German eagles to American operations, from the Reich's stolen wealth to the Cold War's poisoned legacy. And somewhere in the intersection between what America claimed to be and what America actually was, Between the values it espoused and the methods it employed, the ghost of the Third Reich lived on in institutions that wore the flag of freedom while carrying forward the moral flexibility of their defeated enemies. The transformation was complete, but the corruption was permanent.